In the heart of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, amidst the public spectacle of power and the hidden corridors of intrigue, two women stood at the center of a clandestine drama that rivaled the regime's most shocking revelations. Sajida Talfah, the steadfast consort who bore witness to decades of political turmoil with stoic resolve, and Samira Shahbandar, the elusive figure whose enigmatic presence cast a shadow over Saddam's rule, each held secrets that resonated far beyond the walls of their gilded palaces. Their stories, intertwined with Saddam's ruthless pursuit of dominance, reveal the harrowing realities of life within one of history's most enigmatic regimes. Saddam Hussein's relationship with his first wife, Sajida Talfah, cannot be fully understood without examining the tribal, political, and familial context of his early life in Tikrit. Born in 1937 in the small village of Al-Awja near Tikrit, Saddam was raised in a culture steeped in patriarchal tradition, clan loyalty, and the political legacy of Ottoman and British colonial rule. His father disappeared before his birth, possibly dead, possibly absent, and Saddam was raised by his mother Subha and later by his maternal uncle Sajida Talfah, a strong Arab nationalist and a pivotal figure in shaping Saddam's ideological foundation. Sajida was not only the daughter of Sajida Talfah, she was also Saddam's first cousin. The two were engaged at a young age in an arrangement typical of their tribal milieu, where alliances were solidified through bloodlines. This wasn't just a familial match, it was a political one. Sajida, fiercely pan-Arabist and anti-Western, saw promise in Saddam, and the engagement reinforced ties between two branches of the Albu Nasir tribe, which later became Saddam's key power base. Sajida, born around 1935, was 2 years Saddam's senior and, unlike many women of her generation, received formal education and became a schoolteacher. The two married in 1963, shortly after the Ba'ath Party's brief seizure of power in a coup that year. At the time, Saddam was a low-ranking party functionary, but already viewed as ruthless, ambitious, and ideologically driven. Their marriage took place in Baghdad while Saddam was briefly out of political exile and attempting to establish himself as a rising figure in Ba'athist circles. It was a critical moment in his life, professionally unstable, politically risky, but personally significant. By marrying Sajida, Saddam not only honored a tribal obligation, but also cemented an alliance with one of his few consistent mentors and supporters, Sajida. Unlike many later autocrats who sought glamorous wives for public show, Saddam's initial union was deeply traditional and politically strategic. Sajida was quiet, devout, and not interested in public visibility. She accepted, even embraced, the role of mother and homemaker. The couple had 5 children, 2 sons, Uday and Qusay, and 3 daughters, Ragad, Rana, and Hala. Their family quickly became symbolic of Ba'athist domesticity, even as Saddam's political ambitions were rapidly accelerating. What is often overlooked in biographies is the early emotional bond between Saddam and Sajida. Though much of their relationship would later be marked by betrayal and distance, accounts suggest that in their early years, Saddam showed genuine affection for his wife. He supported her education, and when he was forced into hiding or imprisoned, maintained correspondence with her. In rare public photos from the 1960s, Sajida appears at his side, not as a prop, but as a silent partner. The early years of Saddam's marriage coincided with his rise through the Ba'ath Party ranks. His political career gained momentum after the Ba'athist coup of 1968, which brought the party back to power. As deputy to President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, and later as de facto leader, Saddam used his marriage to reinforce his image as a loyal family man and tribal son, an image carefully cultivated to resonate with the Iraq's conservative population. Yet, within the growing power and complexity of the regime, this traditional bond would be tested and ultimately transformed. The foundations of loyalty and blood would soon compete with ego, ambition, and personal betrayal. The seeds of future discord, particularly involving Sajida's children and Saddam's later romantic entanglements, had already been planted. As Saddam Hussein entrenched himself deeper into Iraq's political machinery following the Ba'ath Party's successful coup in 1968, his relationship with Sajida Talfah began to shift from intimate partnership to distant formality. Now serving as vice president under Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, Saddam was the real force behind the government, a calculating operator mastering the internal dynamics of the Ba'ath regime. This rise in power dramatically altered the texture of his personal life. Sajida, once a young, educated woman married into idealistic nationalism, now found herself cloistered in the rigid environment of Saddam's increasingly authoritarian household. Saddam did not encourage his wife to participate in political life, nor did he permit her to serve as a visible first lady. This absence from public affairs was by design. Saddam believed that the public display of women in leadership roles could undermine traditional values and alienate the conservative segments of Iraqi society, particularly the tribal elites he relied upon. Despite the conservative front, the palace life Sajida inhabited was far from peaceful. Saddam was obsessed with control, not only of the state, but of his personal environment. Family members, including cousins and half-brothers, were positioned in key roles across the military and security services. While Sajida technically stood as the matriarch of this emerging dynastic structure, her actual influence was minimal. She had access to immense privilege, luxurious residences, wealth, and servants, but her opinions did not shape policy, nor did they restrain her husband's increasingly erratic decisions. By the early 1970s, Saddam's grip on power had tightened. He established brutal security networks, purged rivals, and cultivated a cult of personality that idolized him as the father of the nation. The image of Saddam as the patriarch of a united Iraqi family extended to his public portrayal: stern, dignified, and domestic. Occasionally, official photographs would circulate of Saddam seated with his children, Uday on his lap, Sajida in the background. But these were choreographed representations, not candid expressions of intimacy. Saddam's home was expanding into multiple palaces, and his family was watched as carefully as his ministers. It was during this era that Sajida began to fade from the personal sphere of her husband, replaced not by an equal, but by the growing demands of Saddam's own narcissism. The relationship grew cold, but remained intact, propped up by tradition and tribal duty. Divorce was never an option, especially for a leader trying to model cultural and religious conservatism. Instead, emotional and physical separation became their silent agreement. What is often overlooked is that Sajida never publicly complained, never sought a political platform, and never engaged in resistance, even when later events would place her husband at odds with their son. She remained loyal to the role she was given, despite the personal cost. She raised their children in the shadow of increasing danger: Uday, erratic and violent; Qusay, obedient and secretive; the daughters, educated but kept from public life. She witnessed the consolidation of a regime that became synonymous with repression, and she knew well the man at its center. Yet even in her silence, Sajida played a role. Her tribal connections continued to protect Saddam from potential fractures within his own clan. Her name still commanded respect among conservative factions. And behind the closed doors of Baghdad's palaces, she began to sense a shift. Her husband's growing interest in another woman, one who would not be content with shadows. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Saddam Hussein was no longer the hidden hand of the Iraqi regime. He was its undisputed ruler. After formally assuming the presidency in 1979, he wasted no time in executing a brutal purge of potential rivals within the Ba'ath Party. His face was now omnipresent on billboards, currency, and television. Power had been fully consolidated, and with it came the cultivation of a dynastic narrative centered around his immediate family, especially his sons. Saddam and Sajida's eldest son, Uday Hussein, was groomed early to inherit power, though this was not a matter of clear constitutional succession. Uday, born in 1964, was a volatile and unpredictable figure, often described by insiders as a spoiled, cruel child who developed into a sadistic man. From an early age, he showed signs of both brilliance and instability. He studied at prestigious institutions and showed early interest in engineering, but was also notorious for violent outbursts, including episodes of beating teachers and shooting at animals for sport. Saddam, while proud of Uday's intelligence and charisma, increasingly found himself trying to control his eldest son's unpredictable behavior. Nevertheless, he allowed Uday to rise through the ranks, giving him key roles in the media and youth organizations. Uday became head of the Iraqi Olympic Committee and the Saddam Fedayeen, roles that he used to torture athletes and opponents with impunity. For Sajida, Uday's behavior was emotionally distressing. Despite her husband's distance, she maintained a fierce maternal bond with her children, particularly with Uday. She frequently intervened to shield him from repercussions, and he in turn idolized her. This made Uday particularly hostile toward any perceived threat to his mother's status, especially when rumors began to circulate of another woman in Saddam's life. His loyalty to Sajida was personal, fanatical, and eventually deadly. The younger son, Qusay Hussein, born in 1966, was the opposite of Uday in temperament. Reserved, calculating, and discreet, Qusay operated largely in the shadows. Saddam entrusted him with control of the Republican Guard and internal security. Qusay's loyalty and competence made him a more favorable candidate for long-term succession, especially after Uday's erratic behavior spiraled further in the 1990s. Saddam seemed to orchestrate a deliberate balance. Uday, the flamboyant and feared enforcer of the regime's external image; Qusay, the quiet overseer of its security apparatus. This dual track allowed Saddam to keep both sons in competition, ensuring that neither would consolidate power too quickly. He viewed his family not through a lens of affection, but as political instruments. This dynamic extended to his daughters as well, Ragad, Rana, and Hala, who were educated and married into powerful political and military families. Their marriages were arranged to strengthen alliances and reward loyalty. Sajida played a more active role in her daughters' lives, choosing suitors and overseeing the household. But even the women in Saddam's family were pawns in a larger political chessboard. The children bore the weight of their father's regime, each symbolizing aspects of his rule. Uday, the brutal face of Saddam's excess; Qusay, the cold executor of internal order; and Sajida, the silent mother whose influence, while emotionally significant, could not counterbalance the forces her husband had set in motion. As Saddam's personal ambitions grew, so did the fractures in his family. And it was through these cracks that another woman would soon enter. A woman who would destabilize the already delicate equilibrium. By the mid-1980s, Saddam Hussein's personal and political life reached a critical juncture. Iraq was deep in the Iran-Iraq War, and Saddam's carefully cultivated image as a stoic, traditional leader began to show cracks. Not in the public sphere, but in his inner circle. It was during this period, amid war and paranoia, that Saddam initiated one of the most controversial and disruptive personal decisions of his life: his secret marriage to Samira Shahbandar. Samira was not from Saddam's tribal world, nor from his political machinery. She was from the Baghdad elite, educated, refined, and secular. Born in 1946 to a well-off family, Samira had trained as a physician and reportedly spent time abroad, including in London. She was already married to an Iraqi Airways executive and had a son, Mohammed Safi. Her lifestyle and demeanor contrasted starkly with that of Sajida Talfah, who was traditional, reclusive, and tied by blood to Saddam's tribal roots. Accounts suggest that Saddam met Samira through a mutual acquaintance in the mid-1980s, during a period when he began to grow weary of his isolated domestic environment. Whether the attraction was emotional, intellectual, or a product of court intrigue, one fact remains: Saddam was taken by her. He fell into what many would describe as infatuation. Not only did he initiate a relationship, he went further, arranging for her husband to be forcibly divorced from her and eventually marrying her in secret. This decision was not merely personal, it was explosive. Sajida, though largely excluded from political affairs, still held the status of first wife and bore the symbolic weight of Saddam's dynastic legitimacy. Marrying another woman, especially one who did not come from the tribal elite, risked alienating powerful factions. Worse, it shattered the already fragile emotional landscape of the Hussein household. The secrecy didn't last. Rumors began to circulate among Saddam's close aides, and within months, the information reached Uday Hussein, who by then was in his early 20s and increasingly volatile. Uday viewed Samira not just as a rival to his mother, but as a threat to his own position within the family hierarchy. He saw her son, Muhammad, as a competitor. Uday's rage spiraled out of control, leading to what would become one of the most infamous personal crimes within Saddam's inner circle. But before that storm erupted, Saddam tried to manage the situation quietly. He moved Samira into a separate palace and shielded her from public scrutiny. She was never paraded as a first lady or official consort, and even years later, photos of her remain extremely rare. But her presence was undeniable. She traveled with Saddam, often behind closed doors, and held his attention in ways Sajida never could. Some insiders suggest that Samira's influence over Saddam grew in subtle but meaningful ways, especially in his later years. She reportedly had a moderating effect on his temper and encouraged a more refined lifestyle. Whether she affected policy is debatable, but she certainly changed the emotional composition of Saddam's world. The marriage, still unofficial to the public, marked a pivotal turn. It fractured loyalties, intensified family rivalries, and introduced a new figure into the intricate web of palace intrigue. For Saddam, it was a personal indulgence, with political consequences. For Uday, it was an act of betrayal. And for Sajida, it was the moment her world truly began to collapse. By 1988, the Iran-Iraq war had ended in a bloody stalemate. But inside Saddam Hussein's household, another kind of war was erupting. One driven not by geopolitics, but by jealousy, pride, and unrestrained violence. The cause: Saddam's continuing relationship with Samira Shahbandar and the deepening rift between his first son, Uday, and the rest of the family. What happened next became one of the most infamous scandals of Saddam's private life and exposed just how volatile the regime had become, even at its core. Uday had always been volatile, but his rage over his father's second marriage tipped him into a new level of madness. He viewed Samira as a usurper who had humiliated his mother, Sajida, and displaced the family from their place of influence. More importantly, Uday believed that Samira's son from her previous marriage, Mohammad Safi, was being groomed as a potential heir, a belief that may not have been entirely baseless. Though Saddam never confirmed this publicly, Uday was convinced that Samira was manipulating his father to favor her bloodline over Sajida's. The situation escalated to its violent climax in October 1988, during a high-profile diplomatic event at the Mansour Melia Hotel in Baghdad. Among the guests was Kamel Hana Gegeo, a long-serving personal valet and food taster for Saddam, who also acted as a facilitator for the dictator's personal affairs. It was widely believed that Kamel had introduced Saddam to Samira Shahbandar, a fact that would prove fatal. In full view of stunned partygoers and diplomats, Uday approached Kamel and began to beat him with a heavy cane. Witnesses reported that Uday was inebriated and ranting about betrayal and dishonor. As the attack escalated, he pulled a pistol and shot Kamel multiple times, killing him on the spot. The murder stunned even Saddam's closest circle. For all his reputation as a brutal enforcer, Uday had crossed a line by committing a public murder within the protected circle of the regime. The fallout was immediate and complicated. Saddam was reportedly enraged. Kamel had been a loyal aide and confidant, but punishing Uday severely would have exposed the deep fractures within the family and raised questions about Saddam's control over his own household. Initially, Saddam ordered Uday to be imprisoned and even exiled him briefly to Switzerland under the pretense of pursuing higher education. But the punishment was temporary. Within a year, Uday was back in Iraq, his behavior largely unchecked. Sajida, for her part, was devastated. Her son's violent act was born of loyalty to her, but it only deepened the rift within the family. Samira, now acutely aware of the danger surrounding her, retreated further into Saddam's protective shadow. Her presence was more carefully concealed, her movements guarded, her image erased from the public record. Yet she remained close to Saddam, and that proximity continued to fuel Uday's paranoia. The murder of Kamel Gajeo marked a turning point. It exposed the fragility of Saddam's family empire, revealing that power bred not only corruption and cruelty, but also a kind of madness. It showed the world that even the inner sanctum of Iraq's most feared man was not immune to chaos. Uday, once heir apparent, had become a liability. Qusay, ever the quiet operator, was waiting in the wings. And Saddam himself, surrounded by ambition, betrayal, and fear, had to reconcile the legacy he was building with the family that threatened to undo it. By the 1990s, Saddam Hussein's political position had become increasingly precarious, following Iraq's disastrous invasion of Kuwait in 1990 and the subsequent defeat by a US-led coalition in the Gulf War. The world's attention focused on sanctions, weapons inspections, and Saddam's increasingly erratic rule. But within the walls of his palaces, the domestic front was just as volatile. The duality of his married life, split between the loyal but marginalized Sajida Talfah and the mysterious, increasingly protected Samira Shahbandar, remained a source of both political tension and personal strife. Sajida had all but disappeared from public view. In private, she reportedly remained deeply wounded by her husband's betrayal, yet she never publicly challenged him. To do so would not only have been dangerous, but would have risked destabilizing her children's positions in the hierarchy of power. Her silence was not submission, it was strategy. Those close to her described Sajida as increasingly withdrawn. She focused on her daughters and played a more subdued role in managing the sprawling Hussein family, especially as her sons became increasingly involved in state affairs. Uday remained a loose cannon, still feared, still dangerous, but sidelined from formal succession planning. Qusay, ever more trusted by his father, was gaining control of Iraq's intelligence, military, and security services. For Sajida, these internal shifts likely served as both a solace and a sorrow. Meanwhile, Samira Shahbandar remained invisible to the Iraqi public, almost mythic in her obscurity. There are few verified images of her, and her name was rarely uttered in public. Yet those within Saddam's inner court knew she wielded real, if indirect, influence. She reportedly lived in an opulent palace in the Radwaniyah area of Baghdad, guarded by elite Republican Guard units loyal to Saddam alone. Her son, Mohammad Safi, was given prestigious academic opportunities, though Saddam never publicly recognized him as a potential heir. Rumors continued to swirl within diplomatic and intelligence circles. Some suggested that Samira softened Saddam's more violent tendencies in private. Others believed she fueled his distrust of his own family, encouraging him to centralize power further. Whether either version is true, what's certain is that Samira's existence further isolated Saddam from his bloodline. The wives represented two visions of Saddam's rule. Sajida, the tribal, loyal wife of his youth, connected to family, duty, and Iraq's conservative image. Samira, the cosmopolitan companion of his middle age, linked to modernity, privacy, and a touch of Western sophistication. Their rivalry was mostly silent, but its consequences echoed through Saddam's children. Uday never forgave Samira and reportedly tried more than once to orchestrate harassment or intimidation against her. Qusay, less emotionally driven, maintained a cool distance. Throughout this period, Saddam himself continued to orchestrate a delicate balancing act, managing the perception of a unified patriarchal family while secretly splitting his affections, loyalties, and living quarters. He ruled Iraq with theatrical grandeur, but inside his private life, he seemed plagued by distrust, disappointment, and division. And in the wings, the women, one rejected but resilient, the other secluded but influential, remained tethered to the man who had bound their fates to his empire of fear. The years following the Gulf War were marked by Saddam Hussein's deepening isolation. The harsh sanctions imposed by the United Nations, the constant threat of military intervention, and the internal uprisings from both Kurdish and Shiite populations only compounded the pressures on his regime. On the domestic front, however, Saddam's personal life was beginning to unravel. While Saddam had previously been able to balance the competing demands of his two wives, by the 1990s, these divisions were no longer sustainable. Sajida's withdrawal from the public sphere had not been enough to shield her from the consequences of Saddam's secret marriage to Samira. Both women were politically and emotionally sidelined, as Saddam increasingly turned to his sons, particularly Qusay, to handle state matters. As Saddam's grip on Iraq weakened, Samira and her son Mohammad Safi continued to live under the dictator's protection. But Saddam had never formally named Mohammad as a successor, keeping his personal and political alliances fragile. This ambiguity regarding succession became one of the defining features of Saddam's last years in power. Both women, in their own way, were affected by the oppressive nature of Saddam's rule, but neither could escape the consequences of their association with him. As Iraq descended into a new era of violence following the Gulf War, the Hussein family's internal strife mirrored the external conflicts that would eventually lead to the regime's downfall. When Uday and Qusay were both killed during the 2003 invasion, their deaths marked the end of Saddam Hussein's dynasty. The Hussein family had been torn apart by violence, betrayal, and ambition, a tragedy compounded by the brutal regime that had once promised unity under a single ruler. For Saddam, the loss of his sons marked the collapse of his envisioned political legacy. The aftermath of Saddam's regime would see the Hussein family's personal, political, and social standing forever changed. After Saddam was captured by American forces in December 2003, he was taken into custody and subjected to a lengthy trial. The former dictator was eventually convicted of crimes against humanity, specifically the 1982 massacre of Shiite villagers in Dujail, and was executed by hanging in December 2006. His trial was viewed as both a moment of justice for the victims of his brutal regime and a symbol of the end of a 30-year reign that had been marked by violence, oppression, and a thirst for power. With Saddam gone and his sons dead, the remaining members of the Hussein family were left to navigate a new and uncertain world. Sajida Talfah, once the First Lady of Iraq, found herself living in exile. She had fled the country in the wake of the US invasion, along with her daughters, as the fall of Saddam's regime rendered her vulnerable to the very forces she had once helped control. Sajida's life in exile was one of relative obscurity. Her exact whereabouts were not widely known, and she largely faded from public view. Despite her absence from the political scene, her connection to Saddam was never forgotten. She had borne his children, and she had witnessed the rise and fall of a dynasty built on fear. In the aftermath of Saddam's death, Sajida's relationship with her children became more complicated. Sajida remained silent about her experiences. She did not publicly speak out about the years spent alongside the dictator, nor did she offer any reflections on the consequences of the family's violent rule. Her silence stood in stark contrast to the media frenzy surrounding Saddam's capture and trial, where his other relatives, including his half-brothers and cousins, became key figures in Iraq's post-Saddam political and social landscape. Sajida's role as a mother and wife was reduced to that of a tragic figure, her legacy forever tied to a regime of terror. Meanwhile, Samira Shahbandar also faced a quiet life after the collapse of the regime. Though she had not been as publicly visible as Sajida, Samira's role as the clandestine partner to Saddam was well known within Iraq's political elite. After Saddam's fall, Samira was forced to live in hiding. Reports suggested that she had gone into exile, but her precise fate was often clouded in mystery. Like Sajida, she lost everything with the fall of the regime, but Samira's life had been far less political than that of the First Lady. It's believed that she maintained some ties to Saddam's loyalists in the years after the regime's collapse, but her future, much like that of her son Mohammad Safi, was uncertain. Mohammad Safi, Saddam's son with Samira, had been educated in the West and was groomed to be a successor in a future regime. However, with Saddam's downfall, his prospects faded. The Hussein family's post-Saddam history is one of exile, silence, and the remnants of power. Saddam's brutal regime may have ended, but the echoes of its impact on his family continue to reverberate in the lives of those who survived. The years following the fall of the regime were marked by attempts at reconciling the past, but for Sajida, Samira, and their children, there would be no returning to the heights of political power they once knew. They were left to rebuild lives in exile, with the shadows of Saddam Hussein's legacy haunting them at every turn. From the early years of Saddam's rise to power to the tumultuous aftermath of his regime's collapse, the story of his wives and children offers a glimpse into the complexities of life under an authoritarian ruler. In the years since Saddam Hussein's regime was toppled, Iraq has faced numerous challenges in its efforts to rebuild and reconcile its fractured society. The legacy of decades of dictatorship and the aftermath of war have left Iraq grappling with political instability, sectarian tensions, and the ongoing quest for justice and reconciliation. The story of Saddam Hussein's family is a reminder of the enduring impact of political violence and repression on the lives of individuals and communities affected by authoritarian rule. As Iraq continues to navigate its post-Saddam era, the lessons of the Hussein family's legacy remain relevant, a testament to the resilience of the Iraqi people in the face of adversity and the ongoing struggle for freedom, justice, and stability in a country marked by its tumultuous past.